graduated, elevated. Now it's my time to shine, yeah, let's go. Major moves, power moves, take it to the top one time, non-stop.
Hello and welcome to Ph.D. Hard Talk. My name is Noma Mguni. Thank you so much for your time today. Dr. Busisiwe Ntsele, could you please introduce yourself, your university and your research?
Hi, Noma. Thank you so much. It still feels so real when somebody's calling me doctor. I'm just used to being Busisiwe Ntsele. Since it's a research adjustment, it feels good. But my name is Busisiwe Ntsele. I did a joint PhD, which means I was studying with two universities. The first one is Vrije University in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and the second one is University of the Free State in Bloemfontein, South Africa. So that's me.
No, lovely to meet you. So in terms of your research then, could you give us the title of your research, the topic?
Okay, my topic was engaged scholarship, which is basically I was looking at how academia filters back to helping communities solve problems together, which was a co-created project between the University of the Free State and Vrije University in Amsterdam. But I looked at a particular case study. So I looked at the critical study of a South African university, which in community engagement, which was the University of the Free State. So basically my case study entailed looking at communities that are working with our university and what they do together in terms of community engagement.
Love it, thank you. So the first question is, in terms of this discussion, why did you apply for a PhD program?
Firstly, South Africa is known worldly for its previous history. The context of Black women in South Africa was that they were at the bottom of the barrel. And I was one of those first generation scholar where my family, which means that between my family, no one had ever been to university. And if they had been to university from my extended family, they never made it to a doctoral level stage. And growing up, I've always been the child that was curious about knowing about the world. And my mother always called me Professor Lydia Makubu, who was the first female blessed professor in Eswatini. So it prompted me to actually live up to that expectation because I wanted to see the world beyond Black women at the bottom of the barrel. So I said, if I'm supposed to be the first in my family, I'm going to be the first, but I'm not going to be the last because I want to pull other Black girls to come with me through this journey. So I decided I was going to stop my job, go back to school and do this PhD just for the recognition that hard work does finally pay off because our mothers have worked hard and still they retire without getting their dues and their accomplishment. And I thought, since we stand in the shoulder of giants, I want to be that woman that says Black women do need this recognition and I'm going to get it on behalf of them.
Now, you've touched on a number of topics that I was going to explore later. I think that the first one is because I've read through your blogs and I've listened to your defense as well. Do you see yourself as a freedom fighter? Because you've mentioned just now again that, you're not just doing this for you. And you know that our mothers are tired, to which they are tired, essentially. Are you the freedom fighter that we should look up to next, just as Nelson fought for us previously? When I say us, I mean the nation of South Africa, essentially.
Unfortunately, in this world that we're living in and in my context, freedom fighting is not a choice. It's not an option. If you come into this world and you see these injustices, it's either you think, oh yeah, the change that you want to be. And for me, because I know that without Winnie Mandela's fighting for us to own the space and to get the freedom that we have, I also would not be sitting here even knowing how to switch on a Teams call. So it just basically means that I'm just passing the baton forward. So if you want to call me a freedom fighter, human rights is my passion. And because it's my passion, and I believe that once I'm here, it's not just for me. I want to see a ripple effect as well. And unfortunately, with freedom fighting, you don't just fight one battle and you sit down and you're like, yes, we have found our freedom. We can vote now. There's lots of other battles to fight when it comes to especially young Black women. And if you have the spirit to fight, why not fight? Because even if you don't get the wins in your generations, the generations to come are still going to have the courage to fight because they'll still have to fight as well.
No, thank you very much. And, my passion is educating the second and third generation through PhD hard talk, because I feel like if knowledge is accessible and it's easy for people with neurodiversity through discussion, they can learn because they're hearing the audio. They don't have to read for hours. And if they want to do further reading, then they can, which moves me to the next point, which is, what are the benefits of having a PhD since you finished?
Personally, when I started, I really had put the PhD in a high pedestal because, one, I had really admired professors, and because already I was feeling that I don't want to end up in a cleaning job. I don't want to end up in a job that pays me less. I thought I was going to do it because my mom always said that in order to break the chain of poverty, we need to be educated. Education was going to get us there. But the moment I got to the university space, I actually learned at how much undervalued the teachers are and how little they are paid. And it actually also changed the way I see knowledge as a commodity myself, because I'm thinking it should not be sold. We should not be doing it for that. And it has been a transformative process for me in the sense that I didn't think it was a healing journey to do a PhD, but it ended up being one. But the sad thing is that for me, in order for the PhD to heal me, it first had to break me. Because when I realized all these things about myself, that we're still not free, Black women are still not entitled to some of these spaces, and also the fact that I also realized that I was carrying so much shame about being a Black woman. And I had to discover through my PhD process that I don't have to be shameful about my indigenous origins, even though I'm in a space that is practically still white, spaces that are putting us in positions where you have to second doubt yourself all the time. So besides the fact that you get recognitions, you get expertise, you get networks, you have a lot of good contributions, I think that this is a transformative space that I believe that you need to have a lived experience to actually explain the value of a PhD. And that is why I found you and I looked for you in this podcast, because I was looking at ways in how I can share this journey with other people and making it a positive journey. And I thought, wow, there's a Black woman doing this and she's doing what I wanted to do. So why should I start a new thing? Because we are powerful in unity. And I really love the fact that you took it upon yourself to actually make this a mission, because dissemination, we often look at it in a singular way, that people must read, people must go to class. And that is why then we have a hierarchy of knowledge, is that our community knowledge is not important. The knowledge that we get out of the classroom is not important. And part of my thesis was actually to break down those hierarchies of knowledge in terms of saying, whoever came up with the idea that the perfect knowledge must come from some other people, some other context, that is not true. Black people have always had their own way of disseminating knowledge. And we can see that things are changing. Who even knew that we would come to a point where we're disseminating knowledge via social media? Who thought that we'd teach in lectures where there was Teams and Zoom? And then COVID came. We had to constantly be changing. So we always have to change with the times. And most unfortunately, that also requires learning and unlearning. And for me, that's what it did for me, because when I started the PhD, I wanted to prove my worth. I did a PhD so that I could be called Dr. Busi, prove them that I'm worth something as a Black girl in the community. But I realized in this way that actually now that's just the title. I end it, yes, people use it when they want to use it, but my job is only beginning.
You know, you've touched on so many things, and I think the first point that I'll go to is shame. You know, you mentioned that, you know, you had shame. What does that mean in terms of being ashamed of being a Black woman?
When I grew up, I've always been teased about my complexion. I thought being Black was a sin, it was a nemesis. I'd often go home and literally scrub myself because I really wanted to be light-skinned. And all my names, there was a shoe polish that we used for our shoes, which was called Kiwi. And I thought that there was something wrong with me because I couldn't fit in these boxes that were created, that the beautiful woman must be light-skinned, a smart woman must be light-skinned. If you were Black and you were dark, when you were young, you were ugly, when you were old, you were rich. So I always had that in mind, that I was always reserved about who I was. My confidence was not as it should be because I always thought there was something lacking in me, which means maybe if I just colored my skin a bit, I would be fine. I would be accepted. And that affected me in so many ways that by the time I discovered that actually this is not such a bad thing was during my field work, because at home we had a mud heart, and I thought that was also just a symbol of shame, until I got to in this indigenous community where they really valued their indigenous way of building, and the values that were instilled in the community was humility more than anything. Before you're an academic, before you're a doctor, before you're so and so, the important thing is to be a human being, which means Ubuntu must come first. You are because I am. And even in my Zulu culture, we say sawubona when we come across you, which means we recognize you. We recognize your presence. We recognize your ancestral journey. We recognize the fact that you are here in this world for a purpose. And for the longest time, Black women have not been recognized. I did my best to be an A student. I did my best to be someone that does well at home so that I could go and be at university, go and climb mountains. But when I got to university, I had thought that after 1994 in South Africa, the ground was already leveled, the space was prepared for us, and only to find that that was just policy. We still had to tweak the ground to actually walk in it. And as a result, you can see that students in South Africa actually started saying that the world was not for them. And I was part of those students in 2015, which called upon the biggest revolt since 1976, which was the student, the fees must fall movement, which happened in universities in 2015, where students were saying, we don't see Black lecturers like us, we don't see the curriculum representing us, we are still not feeling what it means to be a free young person growing up in South Africa post-independence. So coming from that generation, for me, I must say that is one thing that I can take back to saying when you were asking me about the freedom fighting, that we felt like the previous youth had to fight in 1976. We had to fight in 2015 to say, why are we still being excluded, even though legally we're supposed to be here, but the space is not meant for us. So we have to learn that if there's no seat crafted to you on the table, remove yourself and go create another table that the chair is going to be high enough for you to be visible and seen and your voice be heard. And for me, that was my PhD journey, where I was like, I refuse to write a normal PhD where I don't bring in the voices of the community. I don't bring in the voices of the students. I don't bring in my own personal experiences. That's why I start my thesis with a hypnosis about my history. And then I also talk about what I learned in the communities and the people that I was building this PhD with, because it was a co-created process to reach to this final document, which I have before me now.
Thank you very much, in terms of your explanation. So I will go on the mud huts because, there are jokes when it comes to mud huts. And I know that there are people in the UK right now that will say, yes, Noma, that is true. When we were in school, people would, excuse me for swearing, take the piss and say, do you come from a mud hut from Africa? And so those stereotypes, they affected us as kids because, Sometimes children don't know what a mud hut is. And some of them, maybe they've seen it because their parents have taken them back, to go and see their family members, essentially. But that stereotype of mud huts, it's not just localized to South Africa, just to say to you, it is probably a global phenomenon. I'm sure I could go to the US and someone's had that term where they've said, in school, oh, you come from a mud hut. And you'll be thinking, no, I've never seen one, but what is a mud hut? But to ask those questions again, you propel the bullies, because then bullies will be like, no, you come from Africa, there's mud huts, And there's also a song that we have, which is a Christmas song, and I'm sure people will come for me for this. Who says, basically it says feed the world, and I'm sure in Africa there won't be snow this Christmas time. Wow. Right? It's a feed the world song, and you can Google it. But obviously, if you're from certain parts of Africa, you've seen snow. So then you ask yourself, which parts are they talking about? But people then have that stereotypical view. Just in terms of what you're saying with colorism, it is a global phenomenon, even though the challenges, may be far greater in South Africa. But those who've left Africa, and I mean the sub-Saharan region, and gone into Europe, they face those because it's something that's become a stereotype, whether it would be changed. That's why I asked the question to say, are you the freedom fighter? Are you giving, people who are experts as well as indigenous that voice to say, no, there's nothing wrong with a mud hut because it keeps the house cool. That's why it was invented. It's actually better than a house with a brick.
With all this global warming. And it's very interesting for me now that while we're talking sustainable development goals, global warming, climate change, now people are actually realizing that it's so cool to live in a mud house. South Africa has a housing problem. People are still waiting for the government to give them a house. 30 years later, while people that have land can actually access the land, they can build their own houses. And it's very financially viable because you use recyclables, you use community strategies. It brought unity to mass people that came together to build together. So for me, what really struck me about this community when I was doing my research is I got in there with the timeline. A PhD takes 3 to 6 years, and I had a scholarship for 4 years. I was meant to finish in 4 years. And I knew that I could not finish in 4 years because who else was going to fund me? But when I got to that community, there was no way I could sit down and take my recorder and take my laptop and watch everyone build and start doing interviews. I had to put those things down and start building a mud house myself. And doing that, I didn't know that that was not going to be my healing process because already I was fatigued from the tedious committee ethics application that I had to undergo because nobody wanted to understand that my research was going to take an ethnographic form, and I couldn't say I was going to take 6 months. There was no way I was going to put timelines because I didn't know how it was going to roll out. And of course, I didn't finish in time. And of course, I lost my scholarship. But what I gained in that community was knowing that this is not a construction site. That's the first thing the community leader said. This is not a construction site. We don't work according to project requirements. So whatever they did in their own pace. And they did it with love. And that is how I write about Ubuntu in my chapter, because I realized that this is what academia lacks. If our academic spaces had Ubuntu, we would not be living in such a toxic academic space, And for me, it always reminds me that if I take that lesson back from the community to the academic space, then my engaged scholarship would have been achieved. Because then now it's mutual learning. I learned something from the community. They learned something from me. I didn't go there as an expert to empower the community, but it was mutually beneficial, my being there. Yet my attitude when I started was not that. I had seen myself as the person that was more knowledgeable than the community because I am the academic, I am the researcher. But I didn't know that I lacked simple things like simple values. you know? So this process for me has been transformative in the sense that I don't think there's anything that I can doubt myself with as being a Black girl. I know I'm enough. I know I'm enough. I mean, if I can build a mug hut with my own hands, I know I am enough.
In terms of what you've just said, saying that you know you're enough, I think there's a saying, and I'm going to say this wrongly. You may please correct me. I think it's Umuntu, ngabantu,
Yes.
Umuntu.
Ngumuntu ngabantu. I am
Yes.
because of you.
Yes. Just for people to understand in terms of that saying, which you said already, but that's how you say it in vernacular, essentially. And in terms of what you've just said, going back to your research methods then, I know it's a qualitative study in terms of it, and you said it was ethnographic. How did you go about with that? Because we know now that you had challenges with the ethics team, the committee, and also you went for semi-structured interviews. So how long did it actually take? Because I think often when people apply for their PhD, they think it's going to take 6 months. I've had an extension myself personally, because me too, my research mode requires more time in order for me to collect my data. So could you take us through that process?
Okay. I started my process officially in 2016 and I graduated last year. I finished last year. I graduated. I defended this year. I'm gonna graduate now in December officially. So you can see now how many years I took. But also there was COVID that happened in between. So I had initially said I was gonna take 4 years. I end up taking 8 years. It's due to the ethics processes that were never meant to take into account these indigenous processes, but it's also due to COVID, and it's also due to my own challenges that I had with supervision, bureaucracy, finances, mental health. So it was a very windy road for me. And one of the things that the subtitles that I studied in this ethnographic research was, what is a community? And for me, I had to find that for myself. I had to define in terms of the PhD, where do I find my community? Because I found myself lonely in Amsterdam without a community. Cultural shock in a space where I looked at myself. I didn't understand the language. I didn't understand the way they do things. But this is where I was going to go and do my coursework. And then I would come back, do my research at UFS, and then I would come back, have to write in between either the Netherlands or... So I was someone that was in between. So when I started, I didn't know that I would end up being part of the study myself. I started as a researcher, then I became the research, then I became the community. Now these people end up being my community because they then became my support structures. To be honest, these communities that I studied then became my cheerleaders. They would even call me to encourage me because they were like, you are so powerful. And all the time I would look at the university's explanations and definitions of who a community is and who they're working with. I would see vulnerable people, poor communities. And when I went there, I never saw this. I saw a Black woman owning land in South Africa, a Black woman that was building using her own hands. And for me, I felt like at that point, my research was done. It was just the write-up that was, at that point, difficult, because also for us, this is healing work. This is not just writing for me. If I were to write anything that I was not interested in, that I was not passionate about, so I really find that it was interesting how, as a researcher, my positionality would change all the time. I constantly had to reflect and be like, could I have done this better? What could I have done differently? Where do I see myself in this? Am I not doing the same thing? Even now, before my graduation, I was still talking to my school to say, I don't want to be a researcher that extracts knowledge and disappear from the face of the community. I want to have my graduation lunch at Mireka, because that is the community that I made for myself through this process. And because if I'm saying that these people, one of the key things that ethics was giving me problems with was because they insisted, consent forms said that these people's names should be not identifiable. My community members said, we want to see our stories there. We want to see our names in your PhD. I want my poem to be there and I want it to say Napo. I want my name to be there and I want to have my name there. While we were saying, no, we want to keep you confidential. We can't say your names. So I had to go back and say, unfortunately, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to erase these people from this story because it is their story as well. So those are the things that I was not anticipating, that I would find poor, vulnerable communities that are not poor and vulnerable, but they were empowered people that knew that if you use our research, we want to be there, we want to hear our voices. So it was a constant back and forth. That's why it took longer for me, because I had to make sure that my voice was heard when I was writing as myself. The community voice was heard when I was writing about the community. And even to amplify that digital story you talk about, the podcast, I did it in the community. They did their own stories, I did my own stories, and it was so heartbreaking because we were all crying just from that healing session of realizing how much mountains we carry every day in this journey.
So, I hear what you're saying, and please don't take offense. Do you think you became biased because now you were a part of the community and obviously leaving in their experiences and having to live in your own experiences? Or do you think you were still able to be scientific? And I know I hear you when you say you had to have a voice, but I can see where ethics is coming from in terms of GDPR from a European perspective. I don't know in South Africa how it works, but I know EU, we've got our GDPR.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I think correct. And that's why I love the role of supervisors, because my supervisors were my constant check. They had to come and sit me down and be the people that say, who's talking here? Who's saying this? And I love sociology because it also makes you reflect. So I had to be constantly reflecting. Could I have done this better? Who's talking here? Which are the silent voices? How am I feeling about this? Can I leave this and come back to it the next day? And obviously, I felt like a privileged girl that has had privileges to go to the Netherlands and study all these things. So I was even beginning to question myself to say that, do I even want to be a researcher that's just extracting knowledge from my own people? But also I knew that I had a scientific obligation and academic freedom to actually be the student that I was at that point. So that's why when I say I'm interdisciplinary, I mean I wore different robes at different times. At some places, I didn't play the game well, and my supervisors had to sit me down and be like, we need to reconsider this one and that one and that one. And I'm grateful for Hale for always being there to say to me. She even gave me one of her books that she wrote herself when she was just finishing her PhD. It's also called Battles to Fight. You must find it. It's a good book by Hari Gurashi. And she said, maybe read my book. And for me, the funny thing about academia is that you can say something as Busisiwe and someone will say, no, you're being biased. But when you quote someone else that has said the same thing in a different way, then it becomes valid,
Well, that's why we cite.
Exactly. So I had to cite other scholars that had walked this journey and done the research the way I did it. And also, I had to also come inside myself and see, am I an activist? Am I an academic? Am I both? What does engaged scholarship mean? Initially, when I thought I was going to study engaged scholarship, I thought I was going to have different definitions of what engaged scholarship is. But when I was in the field, that's where I saw the mutual benefit, that you can't go to the community and come back the same. You can't go to the community and not benefit from the community, but still you can't go to the community and not leave anything. That's why the scientific expertise is important. because that's when you bring back your theories. That's when you now break it down and say, okay, I understand what you're saying, but remember, these hierarchies are not something that you can break down now. The structural issues are not something that I can solve alone, that we can fight for now and solve now. Let's start with the smaller battles. What can we do now? And that's the role of an academic. So you learn to compartmentalize things.